Hello, this is Jeremy Falson, SOLAS coordinator and website editor, and welcome back for another segment of the SOLAS interview series. In this series, we invite UNM students to speak to us about their research projects. As this website is an open forum, please feel free to interact with the media by commenting in the section below. Today we are happy to present to you Beau Murphy, a PhD student in archaeology in the Department of Anthropology. Last summer, Beau received a Latin American and Iberian Institute and Tinker Foundation field research grant to pursue research in the southern Andean highlands of Peru. There, Beau assisted the Achanchi Archaeological Research Project's excavation effort as well as conducted preliminary dissertation research. The work will contribute to the incipient body of knowledge regarding the Chanka ethnic group, which existed during 1000 to 1400 AD. At UNM, Beau worked as an archaeological technician with the Office of Contract Archaeology and has conducted seasonal fieldwork in Peru since 2012. Recently, I sat down to speak with Beau about his research at the Achanchi site, and what ensues are the highlights of that conversation. So why did you choose to come to UNM to do archaeological research on pre-Columbian Andean civilization?
Andean archaeology is actually a very difficult and competitive field to make a career in. There's a lot of different challenges to navigate, and as a young student, you kind of want the best mentor possible to help you kind of get through all that and make a career for yourself. So for me, Dr. Hayashida, who's on faculty here at the University of New Mexico, is the best mentor possible for me, and that's why I decided to do research here at UNM.
What drew you to this specific project on the Achanchi site?
Right, so this was my first field season as a graduate student. So I wanted to participate in a project that would potentially help me develop a dissertation project for my future research. So several different factors sort of went into pursuing this particular project. First, I'm very interested intellectually in a specific chunk of Andean prehistory that extends from about AD 1000 to about the early 16th century. And those are broken into two time periods. One's the late intermediate period from about AD 1000 to 1400, and then the late horizon, which is really popular because that's sort of when the Inca Empire took over. So this project at Achanchi allowed me to work directly in that era, as Achanchi was occupied during the late intermediate period.
For those of us who are not familiar with archaeological research, would you mind giving us some insight as to the process that a research team follows in excavating remains at a site like Achanchi?
Sure. So when you're excavating human remains, there's a pretty particular protocol you go under. It's a little bit different than if you're excavating, say, a house or something like that. So in this particular situation, we didn't really know how big this deposit was. It happened to be sort of eroding out of the ground. So what you do is you lay a grid of 1 meter by 1 meter units sort of around where you know there is materials. Then you slowly excavate that all at once to get sort of a clear picture of what's underneath. And as you start encountering more human bone or artifacts and things like that, you proceed even more slowly. So sometimes using brushes or wooden tools, you want to be very careful to, well, first of all, not damage any of those human remains, and also to get the clearest possible picture of how things are oriented, the context, and how those materials relate to each other to make sure that you interpret things accurately. And then when you actually start sort of removing materials, that needs to be done really systematically as well. So what you usually end up doing is mapping every individual bone into a grid of some sort and photographing them and then pulling them out. And sometimes they usually require some sort of supporting material. So when they're getting transferred to the lab, they don't break as well. So sometimes you wrap them in some sort of bubble wrap or aluminum foil to make sure that the bones don't get damaged, or if they're fragmented already, that those fragmented pieces stay together. So later you know that they're part of the same bone. And my particular role in the project, as a graduate student, I had a little bit more archaeological experience than most of the other project members. So I would bear a little bit more responsibility in terms of collecting data or giving instruction to maybe hired workers who hadn't excavated before, or younger students who were gaining their first experiences in that. And then in the field as well, sort of anything can come up. So I tried to just help the project directors as much as I could. And, you know, even just getting to the site was usually kind of a pain in the butt. The truck would break down all the time, or you'd get stuck in the mud. So in that case, just try to be the first guy out of the car, pushing the truck up the hill.
So how does the Peruvian team work with the American one? Are the two teams partaking in the same research project?
Yes, I mean, they work very closely to one another. In Peru, the practice is usually if somebody from a different country wants to conduct research, they do it with a Peruvian co-director. And that was the case with the project that I was participating in as well. So you're very much part of the same team, doing a lot of the same tasks, sort of conversing and communicating with each other continually. So we had Peruvian students as well, and in addition to that, we also hired individuals from the indigenous community to sort of participate in the excavation and help out, and I think they enjoyed that as well. So my experience only extends to sort of the fieldwork aspect, but in sort of my academic work, it appears that most of the formal publications that come out of research are often equally as collaborative.
How was the site discovered and how is it maintained as to not let trespassers loot the area?
Right, so Achanchi is actually a really big archaeological settlement for the area. It extends over about 10 to 15 hectares linearly for about over a kilometer, so it's a really imposing site. And as such, the local community has pretty much always known about it. As far as archaeologists and getting documented, I believe that first happened in the 1940s when the first sort of archaeological work took place. That was one of the first sites that was noticed and documented. As far as maintaining the site and preventing trespassers, there's nothing really in place, unfortunately, to do that. And it's actually quite clear that the site has been looted. And that was sort of an impetus for us to conduct this investigation as well. We wanted to sort of get to these human remains before the looters could do so. Having said that, it is in a fairly isolated location. So from a very small settlement called Talavera, you have to drive about 45 minutes to an hour up a really challenging sort of rural road before you can sort of get to the site. So it probably does not see a large amount of trespassers, but there is some damage done by sort of local farming activities. So maybe the only sort of small amount of protection it does have is its rural location.
What does the current literature tell us about Chanka civilization?
So the Chanka is actually a really unique case. A lot of people have known the name of the Chanka civilization for a long time because it was actually mentioned in ethnohistoric documents really, really early. And that's because they're located in what's called the Department of Apurimac, the department being like sort of a equivalent of a state or a province of something like that. And Apurimac is adjacent to Cusco, which is the homeland of the Inca Empire. So actually, in ethnohistoric documents, the Chanka civilization went into this sort of epic battle with the Inca Empire. Well, I shouldn't say the empire, the Inca culture in their infancy, sort of before they had become an empire. And according to these documents, the Chanka actually lost this battle, and the Inca sort of asserted their dominance over them. And then from that very point forward, it was sort of a turning point in the Andes because the Inca sort of just built on that victory and started expanding outward and created this sort of enormous empire across the Andes. So while it had sort of achieved this notoriety from these ethnohistoric documents, archaeologists hadn't really bothered to go and look and sort of see what the truth is on the ground about Chanka culture and so forth. They sort of just took these documents at face value. So that sort of, for the most part, started to end just very recently when some researchers started going in and doing some more detailed surveys. Because we know that the Chanka ethnic group originated in Andean, where Achanchi is. So sort of what this incipient body of research is starting to tell us about Achanchi society, what we know so far from this aspect of information, is that Chanka society was really composed of just a couple hundred habitational settlements in the Andean area of Apurimac. So as far as how their society was organized and what they did, it looks like they concentrated mostly on sort of agro-pastoral activities. So they were growing some crops, probably some tubers, and also tending a lot of camelids, like probably llamas and so forth. They lived in these really distinct sort of ridgetop settlements. So they'd build a settlement on top of a hill, and they'd build their homes out of sort of stone masonry. These round homes out of stone masonry. And as far as we know, they likely had a sort of dual moiety social structure, where their society is sort of organized into two parts based on descendants. And after that, we think that they probably participated in a lot of conflict based on sort of initial research, but the finer details of Chanka society are still sort of coming into clarity for us.
What were the political, socioeconomic, and environmental changes happening in the late intermediate period?
Well, first of all, I should mention that the late intermediate period is really a political division. So before the late intermediate period is what's called the middle horizon. And it's called that because there was these big sort of expansive political units. In this case, it was the Wari and Tiwanaku states were expanding across the empire. And then when those disintegrated, they start calling it the late intermediate period because things appear to be much more politically fractured. There's no big sort of cultural horizon expanding large territories. So people have sort of noticed some broad trends happening here. So temporally, this is sort of separated into AD 1000 to 1400, give or take. And what seems to be happening is people are moving out of valley floors in the Peruvian central Andes. And they seem to be moving onto these ridgetop areas. So they're going up in elevation. And one really obvious conclusion that is easy to come to is they might have had some sort of defensive concerns. You know, if you're living on a hilltop, that's much more defensible than if you're living in a valley bottom. So one theory that's frequently put out there about this change is that there was a lot of sort of interregional and local conflict going on at this time, and a lot of political fragmentation going on. So that very, very well may be the case. And there's also some people who suggest that it might be a little bit more complicated than that. So at Achanchi, the project director is named Lucas Kellett. He actually got his PhD from here at the University of New Mexico. And he did his dissertation in the area, and he's argued that there's also some environmental changes that play into this. The era that they begin moving to these ridgetops is also characterized by increased aridity. So it may not simply be that warfare is increasing, or warfare may be increasing, but it may be best to understand that in a context of these people had a lot of food shortages, and they had to move to these highland areas to sort of diversify their subsistence. So when you move to the highlands, you can begin sort of more pastoral opportunities as well as agricultural opportunities. So these things, there's a lot of interplay between these things, and researchers are still trying to figure them out. But that's sort of the general changes that we think are taking place, and we're still trying to sort of put in place how they all fit together.
How will collecting data derived from human remains at the burial site shed light on Chanka civilization patterns?
So I alluded to earlier that there are some different ideas about why Chanka are located on these hilltops. They may have been really worried about their physical safety, or maybe they were simply moving to adjust to changing subsistence practices. So analysis of these interred people at this site can really help us answer this topic. For warfare in particular, we can look at things like skeletal trauma. So on the skeletons themselves, if you see injuries on, say, like the cranium or the lower limbs or the rib cage, that's usually taken as a really direct example of interpersonal violence. So the more instances of that we see, we may conclude that there's in fact a lot of violence going on, and maybe that's why they moved to these locations. But we can also look at things like cranial modification and even diet through these skeletal remains. So cranial modification can be informative because we know that different cultural groups, even within the broader Chanka society, would modify their craniums in specific ways. So based on the data that we get from these burials, we can see if perhaps maybe everybody has the same type of cranial modification. You know, maybe it was a really insular community and they weren't really accepting to outsiders, you know. Or maybe we'll see the opposite, and in fact it's a very diverse array, and maybe they weren't as worried. In terms of diet, there's this really popular tool in archaeology now. It's called isotopic analysis. So by analyzing the bone chemistry, you can look at different isotopes of things like oxygen and carbon and strontium, and you can actually determine not only what people were eating, but sort of where they grew up, where they came from. So if we look at their isotopes, we can look really clearly and see what exactly they were subsisting on. So if their subsistence did in fact change, we could get a pretty clear picture if they were still eating all that maize like they were in prior to the late intermediate period, or in fact it was more mixed practices like we suspect it was. And in terms of origins, by looking at things like strontium isotopes, we can see if these people grew up, right around Achanchi, or if some of them migrated from outer areas. And different conclusions can be made out of stuff like that. Like, if all these people, or if a good portion of these people were coming from outlying areas, that could be seen as an indication that there was not a big security risk there. Maybe they were more accepting of people from other communities, and, warfare was not a huge concern. Or maybe everybody that's interred in this burial grew up in the immediate area and they were very insular. So these are the sort of things that archaeologists are looking at to sort of make inferences about Chanka culture.
In what ways do burial goods of particular individuals enhance our knowledge about Chanka material culture?
Well, previously, most ceramic vessel forms had to be reconstructed from really small fragments from surface collections done on archaeological surveys, or from small fragments collected in household contexts. Burials are sometimes a much better context to receive more complete vessels, and in this circumstance that was true. We managed to recover several completely intact ceramic vessels, and that allows us to sort of reconstruct more directly, previously we had to reconstruct based on these small fragments what these vessels were, what these different forms were, and this gives us much better data on that because we can see exactly what some of these vessels were, and also we can infer sort of what they were used for. Eventually we can do something like a residue analysis on these vessels and see sort of what plant and animal materials they were filled with. And additionally, in addition to that telling us sort of what these vessel forms looked like and what they might have been used for, it can tell us a lot about sort of Chanka ritual life, because these were interred in burials. And we can look, depending on what is included in those, we can infer that these were ritually important items or vessels or drinks and so forth.
So how do you determine whether a society was peaceful or violent?
Well, archaeologists kind of argue over this a little bit. There's several proxies that people look at. One is architectural, like if you see things like defensive ditches surrounding settlements or big walls, perimetral walls, people kind of assume that that's a sign that there's some violence going on in societies. And there's not really a lot of that in the Chanka culture, except for at a couple of sites. But one of the other things is skeletal trauma, which is a really popular proxy of violence in a society. And I don't know of any universally sort of agreed upon, if there's this percentage of trauma, then we know that it's such and such level of violence. But it's sort of interesting in the Chanka case because there's been a really sort of thorough project done of over, I think, 400 skeletal remains, and sort of half of those interments showed a violent death, or showed violence during their life, and then something like a third of those showed a violent cause of death. So that's a really high incidence by almost any measure. But it's important to note that almost all of those bodies came from cave contexts. So that's a very particular mortuary deposit, and it might not represent Chanka society as a whole. So that's why sort of the work that we did can provide a valuable data set for comparison, because it's a different context and it may represent a different segment of Chanka society.
In your proposal, you point out that, quote, while the importance of enhancing our understanding of such archaeologically impressive cultures such as the Inca and Mochi is clear, it can come at the cost of developing a more complete picture of what life was like for smaller Andean societies through history, end quote. How does research on smaller societies affect the knowledge that we have about pre-contact civilization? In other words, what do hypotheses about Chanka society tell us about their interactions with the Inca?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I think in this particular case, the clearest point is that previously Chanka history was told by the Inca. As mentioned before, ethnohistorians recorded the Great Chanka-Inca War, but they did so from the perspective of the victors, so essentially the Inca authorities. To what degree that is accurate, we have no idea, but for obvious reasons, it seems like there could be a lot of factual errors there in their depiction of their enemies. So archaeological research here has the really clear possibility to let the Chanka material record tell us about Chanka history as opposed to the Inca authorities.
Prior to excavation, it appeared that this burial deposit consisted of high-status individuals. Did this turn out to be true? And if so, what can we learn about Chanka political organization?
So when this deposit was first discovered, it was discovered by Lucas Kellett, a researcher who was actually doing a different project, and he was walking by this area and just sort of eroding out of the ground were some human bones, including some lower arm bones, and attached to one of them was this really impressive sort of copper bracelet. And that's not something we've seen in other contexts. It was a much more sort of impressive burial item. So for that reason, we were sort of safe to sort of guess that maybe there was elites buried in this area. Whether or not that's true is going to have to wait further analysis. So we excavated the whole deposit, and we didn't find the general correlates that archaeologists use to determine like a rich or elite burial. Usually for something like that, you look for a really large presence of burial goods, offered with these people to accompany them into some sort of afterlife. And in this case, the offerings were very modest, and there's not really a big reason to assume that they had a much different social position than other people in society. But that's not definitive. I mean, just the fact that they were interred in this much different context than all the previous cave burials that we found may indicate that they were in some way unique. Or it may simply be the case that there's a very small amount of status differentiation in this society. I mean, that would seem to be indicated by other archaeological things, like all of their houses are roughly the same size, all of them seem to contain roughly the same quality of contents. So a more definitive analysis of that will have to wait for things like the isotopic studies and artifactual studies that I was talking about.
Are there any additional excavations currently planned at Achanchi?
At this time, as far as I know, there's not any additional excavations planned at this particular site. In fact, the excavation that we did was in a way sort of an opportunistic salvage operation. As I mentioned before, the burials were sort of eroding out of the ground, so they're at a really high risk of being either looted or damaged. So we went in there to take the necessary steps to sort of prevent that incidental destruction, and we're going to use that, I think, really effectively in our research. But from here, our work on the Chanka Society is going to be taken pretty much to the laboratory. So these remains and artifacts are going to be curated at a nearby museum, and from there a number of Peruvian and American researchers are going to begin to work on them and study them probably for years to come. Additionally, there's a really great bioarchaeological field school that's run out of there by Daniel Curran, who works at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a professional Peruvian archaeologist named Emmanuel Gomez. And so they're going to have young students in there, probably training them with these remains as well to become future researchers, and hopefully in the years to come they can answer all of our questions about Chanka society.
Thanks to Beau for stopping by and sharing his research experience with us. I hope all of you have enjoyed listening. Please join us next semester as the SOLAS interview series will continue to feature research projects and other Latin American related content.